As part of a continuing series of talks who were influenced by Raymond Williams, it's my pleasure to introduce my old friend, Morag Shiach. Morag Shiach was the last postgraduate student to be interviewed, to be supervised by Raymond Williams at Jesus College. She is now Professor of Cultural History at Queen Mary University of London. Morag, would you like to talk a little bit about how you met Raymond Williams, what it was like being with him at Jesus College, and the influence he's had on you and your academic work?
Thanks, Mary, for that introduction. Well, I first met Raymond Williams when I arrived at Cambridge to begin my PhD in 1983. I had done my undergraduate studies in Glasgow, at Glasgow University, and have become increasingly interested in various issues of communication, cultural history. I studied film right at the very beginning of that as a kind of academic discipline at Glasgow. And then I went to McGill University in Montreal, where I did a master's degree in communications. And that was a really interesting place where there were people studying journalism, various forms of mass media, as well as looking at cultural theory and cultural history. And at the end of that, I had become very interested in the way that we use the idea of popular culture and all the different kinds of historical, political, and theoretical work that that idea has done. And I decided I would be really keen to do a PhD and felt that working with Raymond Williams would be a very exciting opportunity if that were to be possible. So I applied to Cambridge, to the English faculty, despite the fact that I didn't have a degree in English, because my undergraduate degree had been in drama and philosophy, and my master's was in communication. And I was very fortunate that the person who was in charge of considering applications for PhD study at that point was Lisa Jardine, who again I hadn't known before. But she saw the potential of having somebody with that different disciplinary background come and study in the English faculty. I'd also recognized that Raymond was the only person who really could potentially be a supervisor. So although he had just actually retired at that point, she persuaded him that he had the time to take on one more PhD student. So I was accepted to study in the English faculty, and I arrived at Jesus College and met Raymond at our first supervision.
Can you remember that first supervision?
Yes, very clearly, actually. I remember, his room in Cambridge, and he had read my master's dissertation, so he had asked to see some of the work from my master's degree before we met. And I was slightly self-conscious because some of that involved a consideration of his work. So I had been looking at, various different approaches to thinking about popular culture, and talked about his work. So that was a slightly daunting idea, but he was very, very supportive and said, "Oh, you've got some, interesting points there that we will, I'm sure, discuss in the course of your studies over the next 3 years," and just seemed to be quite accepting, but also quite open. And then I suppose there were two things I remember from that first supervision. One of which I have constantly used to provide a bit of context and support for my own PhD students, which is to say, right at the beginning, there's no such thing as a perfect PhD dissertation. Anything you write is capable of critique, and people can raise issues about it. So please don't try instead to write the perfect dissertation, but it needs to be a project that matters. So that putting the emphasis on the impact of research in terms of how it could make a difference, rather than on its need to be absolutely perfect, was a really helpful and enabling project. And then the other thing he did was made a suggestion about how I might start, because I was trying to do a project that was looking at different historical periods, looking at different kinds of genre. You know, I looked at theatre, I looked at poetry, and it was difficult to see how to begin was the difficulty. And he suggested I do a kind of keywords type project for my first chapter. So I would do a historical inquiry into the etymological roots of the idea of popular culture. And that was actually an excellent suggestion. I wouldn't have thought of it. And he didn't give me any more advice than that, really. He just said, I think you should start by really understanding the historical resonances and roots of this idea of the popular. And actually, once I'd done that, the subsequent chapters, the shape and the argument were all really quite straightforward to identify. So he did both of those things in the first supervision. And just said, you know, on you go, you know where the library is. And that was actually very helpful. It was a good beginning.
He was a presence in Cambridge, around Cambridge in 1983. He gave one or two lectures still and attended things. Can you remember going to anything that Raymond Williams did?
I remember him talking at an event, I think at City University. It was probably, was it Marxism Today who'd organised that, or there was a kind of communist university? And I remember him giving a talk which was about the history of political engagements. And there was a moment when there was some very, very sort of serious and sort of self-entitled guy who stood up and kind of held forth. And Raymond just sort of looked at him very quietly and said, you know, I think if you really pursue that position, that does objectively make you a class enemy. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, imagine being called a class enemy by Raymond Williams. What would that feel like? But it was done in a kind of serious but not confrontational way. He was just quite serious as saying, I don't think that position is one that you could sustain as a progressive thinker. So I do remember that had quite an impact on the room, never mind on me. And I heard him give, he actually came to Jesus College and gave a talk as well about, actually about modernism. I think it was when he was thinking about that kind of material. So yes, I did hear, but I didn't go to, I don't think he was doing any undergraduate lectures in Cambridge when I was there, or if he was, I didn't know about them and didn't attend them.
Now, Jesus College is also very interesting because it is Raymond Williams' own college.
Indeed.
It's also where Lisa Jardine was. It's where I believe Delia Swindles was, and Suzanne Reiters as an undergraduate at that time, and of course Stephen Heath. So would you like to talk a little bit about the academic community at Jesus?
Yes, it was both the postgraduate community and I think the community of people researching and teaching English was a very lively one. I mean, Suzanne actually had at that point just gone off to Yale to do her master's degree. She then came back, but she was very much a presence because she had obviously been a very, you know, engaged and interesting undergraduate. And people certainly would say, oh, you must meet Suzanne when she comes back and that sort of thing. So she was kind of present, though physically she was absent. And I think it was a very engaged, you know, we had there was a kind of variety of groups that brought together undergraduate students and postgraduate students. We had a sort of left group. We had a reading group. When the miners' strike happened, there was a miners' support kind of group there as well. So there was a lot of connections between undergraduates, postgraduates, and fellows that I think isn't common everywhere. Lisa was hugely energetic, you know, produced a very supportive environment. Julia Swindells, as you say, was doing her PhD at the same time. So there were lots of formal and informal exchanges and discussions, and we all attended some of the same seminars. I mean, like the 19th century seminar that Gillian Beer and Adrian Poole were running then. became a really important place, as did Gareth Stedman Jones's social history seminar. And certainly quite a number of us attended those. And that produced a sort of space for thinking about methodologies around cultural history, for thinking about the way that we describe culture, which was sort of important for my project because of thinking about popular culture as a term that is constantly reinterpreted and repositioned in relation to other kinds of debates. So I would say, I mean, I chose Jesus College because Raymond was there. I didn't really know much about the setup in Cambridge. So other people said to me, well, you didn't have to go to Jesus just because your supervisor was there. But it did seem to make some sense. And actually, I think that was quite useful. It was just easier to contact him, to be around when he was around. So that was very helpful. But no, it was a very lively environment with some really excellent people. And as a college, it provided accommodation, it provided funding for conferences and other kinds of research expenses. And it was absolutely ahead of the game in terms of providing computers for PhD students. There was a funny little room in the basement of North Court, which is one of the modern buildings, where there were, I think, 3 terminals where PhD students could, if they so chose, produce their PhD on a computer. And I'd actually done that for my master's degree because in McGill, they were a few years ahead in terms of that kind of approach. And that felt quite helpful in terms of finishing.
Do you remember anything about feminist networks or women's groups at that?
Yes, exactly. There were lots, weren't there? I mean, from the kind of just the sort of remember the behave badly badges that we all wore for a while, just a kind of recognition. And I also think, certainly if I think of Gillian Beer or Lisa Jardine, they were very supportive of women within the academy, and I felt welcomed really. And I also have always been a bit of a joiner of things. So, I was on the now I've forgotten. I mean, so many governing bodies, I've forgotten what it was called, but it was the governing body of Jesus College had students on it, and I was one of those. So I began to get to know lots of people, and was also quite active in the postgraduate community, the MCR. So I had, and we had an excellent graduate tutor as well who was very supportive. So I mean, of course there were frustrations. Of course there were things about the historical dominance of the colleges that only admitted men and the relative gap in wealth. I mean, we all read enough Virginia Woolf to know how that feels. But I felt, I suppose, quite optimistic because it would never have seemed to me likely as a teenager in rural Aberdeenshire that I'd land up as a PhD student in Cambridge. So I suppose I felt the point of access had given me some opportunities that I might not have expected to have. And I was quite optimistic about how that could enable me to do work that I would feel was worthwhile. So I wouldn't say that I felt, I mean, I was not unaware of the structures of power. I certainly relied on friendships and alliances and collaborations, particularly with other women. But I wouldn't say I was overwhelmed by it. And Raymond was very accepting. He never seemed to, I mean, he seemed to be pleased to think that somebody wanted to do the kind of work that I wanted to do and was pleased to help me do it.
Mm. It's interesting, Morag, because thinking about Raymond Williams's own roots, his consciousness of Welshness, did you ever feel that kind of connection to your roots in rural Aberdeen? Do you have those kind of feelings, or did you ever talk about those feelings?
Not a lot, no, actually. I think, I mean, he was of a very different generation to me, and the experience of nation and region changed, I think, between the time that he was growing up in Wales and the time that I was growing up in Scotland. So, I mean, you're right. I have, as part of my engagement with cultural history, which is mostly focused on these islands, I have worked a bit on some of the most important Scottish writers. I've worked on Grassic Gibbon. I've worked a bit on Hugh MacDiarmid. So, that element is part of the way I think about it. But I guess I do think of myself as a British citizen. I know people dispute whether that's even a viable identity, but for me, it's a viable identity. And, something about contact with the urban, it is really important to me. I think that you can produce versions of yourself that are more creative and maybe more, maybe less traditional in cities than you can in rural communities. So, I know some of the benefits of a small community where everybody knows who you are. But I really like the benefits of a big city where not everybody has to know everything about who you are all the time. And I have sought out cities. I've lived in Glasgow, I've lived in Montreal, I've lived in London.
You were also there at a very important critical moment. Part of that critical moment was the McCabe business. But basically, Cambridge was riven in two over the appointment of Colin McCabe,
Yeah.
who had done very, very important work in the area of film theory. And of course, that whole area of film communications wasn't really accepted in the English department. And those wars had been hugely rancorous. Do you want to say anything about
Yeah.
about that?
Well, I mean, I mentioned that I had studied some film theory in Glasgow as an undergraduate, and clearly, we read a lot of articles in Screen, and Colin McCabe was one of the key authors there, as indeed, of course, was Stephen Heath, who was there at Jesus when I arrived, still is, I think, and so they were kind of important figures for me. And then when I went to McGill, it was framed rather differently. So it's interesting how these kind of battles get framed differently. So I would say in McGill there was more of a kind of sense of the different traditions being those that are in sort of sociological studies of media versus more theoretical studies, and both were given a space. But I guess most of the people that I was most influenced by were also reading Colin McCabe and also reading Stephen Heath and certainly reading Althusser. That whole area of intellectual inquiry had been one I was aware of from the time I was an undergraduate. So it was quite strange to me to come to Cambridge and discover this, conflict that I couldn't connect to any kind of substantial intellectual debate. It seemed quite parochial, really. It just seemed a kind of reaction of pushing back against some ideas that struck me as just important and interesting, and we should be debating them. So, and when you say, well, there wasn't maybe sort of much room in the English faculty, that's certainly how some people saw it. They saw theory, and particularly French thought, as very, alien, which is quite odd for a faculty and a tripos that gave so much space to certain kinds of European philosophy. If you think about how they thought about the tragedy paper and so on, they put in a lot of thought that was quite international. But anyway, there seemed to be a particular problem with French theory and with what that was seen to do to the study of text. But, when I got the chance to teach undergraduates with Lisa and with Julia Sandels, actually, in the literary representation of women paper, we did used to talk to them about some of those theoretical positions. We certainly used to talk about Lacan. We certainly used to talk about Althusser. And I got quite involved in the graduate seminar that happened amongst students in French. So, and became, an editor of the journal Paragraph, which dealt particularly with that kind of critical tradition at the time. I then published a book on the writer Hélène Cixous, who also, was part of that context of debate that was quite theoretical and quite reflective, quite philosophical in terms of its textual reading. So I found plenty of spaces in Cambridge to have those discussions. I wouldn't say that it was really a direction that Raymond was going in at all. I mean, I did not have those conversations with him. We talked about historical methodology. We talked about cultural history. We did not talk about Lacan or Althusser, or indeed ever about Colin McCabe. So, or at least maybe, I mean, I think I did see an image of him, wasn't there? There's a famous photograph of him sort of standing protesting at the point at which the decision not to renew Colin McCabe's post was made. So I think he had a kind of, commitment to the idea that this had been badly handled, but he had no intellectual commitment to the writers that Colin McCabe was engaging with, I would say.
Would you just like to talk about Queen Mary and Raymond Williams's ideas in your teaching and in your writing during the bulk of your academic career at Queen Mary?
Yes, well, I would say that's two different phases. I mean, just when I was, just when I finished my PhD and had my viva and everything, of course, Raymond had died. And that was a terrible shock because I had thought, he would be an interlocutor, but wasn't. And unsurprisingly, around then, there was a lot of activity of, writing pieces, summing up. So I published some work which was about Raymond's, arguing about various aspects of Raymond's work and presenting some ideas and so on. So that was a phase of sort of in a memorial kind of framework, I suppose. After that, I did get involved with Raymond Williams Society, along with Jeff Wallace, Bill Schwartz, Carol Watts. And we ran, we set up the idea of the Journal of Keywords. We had some conferences around his work. And then it was just a kind of feeling of, it felt like we were reaching fewer and fewer people. So I would say, that was maybe a period of 5 to 10 years when people wanted to respond in that kind of memorializing way. But it all, I think, needed to be reinvented. I think we needed to stop and think, okay, what does his work mean now for people? So I stopped being involved in that society, though it's carried on. And then I think his presence in my thinking was deep, but not so visible. I mean, I think the ways I approach my research are absolutely shaped by those connections between thinking about the history of language, the history of organizations, thinking about how texts, for me, primarily have to be subjected to historicized modes of reading. And I think that's what my work is. And it's not always a question of writing a piece about Raymond Williams's work. It's more about having absorbed those kinds of ideas. And that certainly, I would say, if I look at the things I teach, how I teach them, PhDs that I've supervised, that sort of thing, then his work and his methods are central to that. And what's amazing, how often you're struggling, you're wrestling with an idea, and then you read one of his books and you go, oh, he said that, So sometimes I feel like I'm reinventing through a process of kind of, coming to my own conclusion, only to find that he came to that conclusion quite a long time ago.
We haven't talked about really what is absolutely central to me about Raymond Williams, and that is adult education. Because, of course, he did spend the whole 50s in the adult education movement, the Oxford Delegacy, the WEA. And I remember at that moment when we were reading with shock at his death, the thought that we ought to do something that recognised the relationship with adult education. And we both went to Barlaston.
Yeah, I remember.
And made contact with Derek Tatton there.
Yeah.
And I still have a photograph of us, planting a tree there.
Of course.
Can you just talk about any of that?
Well, I suppose one of the things is that the context of adult education has changed in one way, in a number of ways, but specifically, we have so many more adult learners in universities than we did then. I mean, clearly there's always been a route into education for mature students, but you know, most of my engagement with adult education, adult learners, has been through Queen Mary, where we had a significant portion of the students who came in well beyond the age of 21. And we had all sorts of access agreements with some of the colleges in London, you know, things like City and Lit that would do those access courses that would allow people to progress into university. And I certainly had a particular sense of the importance of developing ways of teaching and supporting students that met the needs of people who came in through that route, as well as through what might have been seen as the more obvious routes of A levels or whatever. And that's where I have had most opportunity to work with mature learners and just to recognize what it means for people when they access higher education at different stages in their lives.
Did you have a relationship with Joy Williams? You met Joy Williams at
Yes, but not a long-standing one, just around the time of Raymond's death and the memorial service for him at Jesus and that kind of thing. So not a lot, no.
Would you like to say anything about her influence? How strong you think it was on Raymond's work?
I think I'd be speculating if I did. I mean, it was clearly a very strong intellectual and political partnership. And I'm sure that there was a very strong influence. It's not a conversation I would really feel I had anything to add to, though. I mean, not really.
Well, Morag, thank you so much. Thank you for all those insights into your time at Cambridge and to your relationship with Raymond's work.